Good afternoon. My name is Stephen Everts. I'm an advisor for the EU's European External Action Service, the sort of the diplomatic wing of the European Union. And I'm delighted that in this magnificent setting we have an opportunity to talk about the European foreign policy performance. Sort of the exam question that we're faced with is, when will the EU's actions speak louder than words? Which is a good question, because sometimes in foreign policy what you say is what matters. But I think we can all agree that what we do matters as much, if not more. So to grapple with this question, I have two excellent speakers. To my left, we have Marek, Cichocki, who works at the Natolin European Center. And I have Eka, to my right, Tkeshelashvili, and I apologize like others before did for the mispronunciation already. Anyway, who's the president of the Georgian Institute for Strategic Studies. Now, this question of when will the European actions speak louder than words, I think the first sort of case study that we should probably apply this question to is the Ukraine crisis, because it's been such a primordial crisis where, as we discussed it many times already at this conference, everything's changed. It's the crash test for the Europe's foreign policy machinery. So I'm going to ask each of you just to cast your mind back to last November, which is one key moment. There have been other pivotal moments, but that was a key moment when the Ukraine crisis really took on a much more dramatic turn. And if you can, each of you, just give me a sense of, between November and today, how do you assess the EU's response, which has been a combination of sanctions, of diplomatic efforts, through EU institutional levels, or sometimes through member states led efforts. Can you just talk me through how each of you has seen the evolution of that response? Eka, why don't you start, and then we'll turn to Marek.
Thank you, and I'll just take a liberty to go maybe earlier than the November.
Please.
Not that much perhaps, but then something that gives a reflection of what happened actually in November and then what followed. And then I will put that in the framework of the Eastern Partnership as an excellent initiative from the side of the EU, but then how it all started basically. And it was not designed from the outset when deliberations started about Eastern Partnership as a response of any kind to the war in Georgia in 2008, but then acceleration of the way how that came into effect actually materialized obviously was part of that as well. And then if we dig deeper into that, I guess the limitations in the way how strategically the objective of the Eastern Partnership has been set from the beginning had its own effect how we ended up maybe where we are right now. Not to the full effect, or it's not the full result of that obviously, but then there are roots that are maybe one can find in that starting point of the Eastern Partnership as well. And then the whole strategic premise, how this design has been contemplated, had a very significant limitation, because it was based on the concept of possibility of shared neighborhood with the strategic partner Russia. So that it was not an integrational project, it has nothing embedded into it as a transitional stage for the eventual membership, or even an explicit acknowledgement of the possibility of that type of the countries who were part of the Eastern Partnership. But it was specifically designed as a way of helping out countries who were part of this project of becoming countries that would be like European countries in a normal sense of that, obviously. Something that the people of those countries, some to the more degree rather than the rest, when we speak about the determination to act upon it, were desiring to do so, obviously. But it missed the whole point, which was, even at that time, quite obvious to us, perhaps, like the country of Georgia, who suffered invasion of Russia and then still is under partial occupation of Russian forces, that there was a troubling hope, how much shared concept of the neighborhood with Russia, which was ready to play the zero-sum game, basically, of with Europe for the countries who it sees as part of its own privileged sphere of influence, would actually play out, and how strong-handed Europe would have been with the tools that have been embedded in Eastern Partnership to overplay some sort of an upper hand that Russia had with its resolve to act with whatever means that it would have acted. Because understandably so, Europe would not contemplate to act with the means that Russia is using, obviously. So that's how it all started, I guess, with the mistaken honorable hope of playing out the Eastern Partnership in that sense. And it's not only Ukraine as the biggest hotspot right now, that we can look at, but then we already had the case of Armenia, we have the limitations in Georgia, what would be the way forward, and then hopefully now there would be better perspective to reassess before the Riga summit in 2015, what could be the tools that could lead better in a strategic way, I would say, for the countries like Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova at least, who are determined to be part of Europe, to actually be really helped in getting to that point.
I think it's a terrific question, but before we get to where do we go next, I want to give Marek sort of an opportunity to assess to how did we get to where we are today. And I think your point about, as you see it, sort of the design fault at the outset of the Eastern Partnership about this assumption of Russia agreeing to share the neighborhood on basis that we could find some sort of accommodation or reason. Okay, there's a brilliant point, but I want to hear from Marek. Sort of, how do you see sort of the process that led us to where we are today in respect of Ukraine crisis, our choice to eliminate the military tool from the outset, I mean, which some people criticize, other people think that was realistic and wise. It's not for us to engage an adversary precisely on the terrain of a policy field that doesn't lend to our strength. But anyway, Marek, how do you see the process to where we are today?
Yes, I wouldn't criticize European Union of not using military means. It's obvious. But if you observe the whole situation after Vilnius summit and then after the annexation of Crimea, what you see on the side of the European Union, this constant feature of this mechanism that the European Union is something which reacts very slowly. And sometimes it's good, but sometimes it's a problem. And I think especially in a situation of a crisis, of war, of military conflict, it starts to be a problem. And if you observe this span of time between Vilnius summit and a situation after the annexation of Crimea and a Russian attack on Ukraine, so you see that the slowness is insufficient and ineffective because it gives responses too late. All responses of the European Union were in this span of time too late. So it's too late. So the European Union is still 1, 2, or 3 steps behind what is happening, and that is probably the biggest problem with the European Union in this very particular, very difficult geopolitical situation.
Thanks a lot. I think many people would, and indeed at this conference already have pointed to this. EU is an integration project, and some people call it sort of a postmodern construction, and it's difficult to deal with very modern or more geopolitical entities. If we can now sort of cast our minds a little bit sort of forward, knowing precisely sort of the organizational culture of the organization, the political lineup of forces, how do we collectively sort of get the EU in a better position to play more of a geopolitical game, to react faster, knowing very well that on the big decisions we do it by unanimity, knowing that we have 28 member states that each have their sensitivities. So if I can ask each of you to now adopt a more forward look and say, okay, we are here. We see the lineup of forces in Ukraine, in the Kremlin, but also in the European Union. How would you assess that, and what would be your advice? Maybe Marek first, and then we'll go again to.
It's difficult because I think the answer is not on the EU level, because of course we can put different expectation into different EU institutions and arrangements, as we did, for example, in the case of the Lisbon Treaty, which should bring us new instruments, especially after the crisis around Iraq and this whole dispute on American unilateralism, those days, should bring us new instruments. But my argument is those instruments, they accommodate itself only to what is the political will, and the political will is still on the level of the member states. So the solution is on that level, and the problem is also on that level. What we need, I think, now in Europe is reshaping our kind of understanding the world. So it means that we have to reshape our own mentality and our own language too, because the language we use reflect our minds. You said it's important how we act. First of all, it's important how we think, how we see the world, and do we really see the real world, or we see only what we would like to see, and how we bring this picture in our language, and then whether we act properly to what is happening. Secondly, we need a real, I think, means of European deterrence, and I think it's very important to be able to deter people who are willing to destroy the order we think is good for the European countries and is also a model for other actors. And I think, thirdly, it is the problem of the smart soft policy, which in this particular case is, of course, the future form of the European neighborhood policy and Eastern Partnership.
Terrific. Okay, Eka, maybe I can ask a similar kind of question to you. Some people say the European Union is bad at tactics, but it is better at the longer term game. And the strength of our societies, the longer term trends in Russia power projection should actually give us a greater degree of confidence that in the long term we are in a stronger position than Russia is. Perhaps in Tbilisi, however, people might say that's fine in theory, but in the meantime we got some real urgent issues to sort out, and maybe you can tell us how you see that.
Yeah, well, if we would compare the views of the threats assessment in that sense from Brussels, I would say in a generalized term, because Europe is diverse, obviously, and from those who are outside the formal institutional framework of what Europe is, even though we believe that we're part of Europe in a greater sense, obviously, there's a great asymmetry of expectations and assessments of the threats. The sense of urgency is much stronger felt, obviously, when you are in the immediate neighborhood of Russia, where you see why it is not an emerging threat or something that could be dealt with the long-term approach into it, but in a very short-term one, and it relates more to the survival, basically, rather than something that could lead to the sustainable development over the time. But then mistaken view, in my understanding, however unbiased could be in that sense in terms of assessing the relevance or validity of the view that the Brussels, in that sense, or Europe can have, is that ultimately this long-term approach and confidence into that could be overrated or exaggerated, because if the gains of the type that Russia attempts to make right now in its immediate neighborhood are solidified ultimately, then the long-term picture could look different rather than it looks right now when we speak about what will be the correlation of forces and then cost and benefits in terms of letting that to happen with the way how short-term actions could be undertaken. And then when we speak about that, obviously Europe is, or EU for that matter, is part of a bigger picture, because when we speak about security, EU is not a security actor. Maybe sometime, someday it will emerge in a different way, but then now it's two pillars, NATO and EU, in the way on a transatlantic community space, how they do act. So closer coordination and work together when we speak about what could be done by actors that are not EU actors in that sense institutionally, and then what EU could do, they should be mutually complementary, because I agree, security-wise, you cannot contribute that much at this point of the time, even though for the development of the security realm of Ukraine, it can do a lot if the peace sustains in that sense. But now it's the immediate urgency of action, what happens in Ukraine, which is the biggest survival test for all of us, not only for Ukraine. What will happen in Ukraine will be a bit of a determination. What will happen with all of us, which are in it together, in a very real sense of that. And security cannot be avoided, because if the security issues with relation to Ukraine will not be dealt with, none of the rest will work ultimately, because Ukraine will be trapped into the instability, into the leveraged position of Russia against Ukraine, and then over the time there will be more voices in EU as well that will make its own arguments that yes, look, Ukraine is a failed state ultimately, so that, I mean, there is nothing much that one can do with this divided nation. That will be very cynical to say, obviously, at the time, but then one can predict that over the time, if there will be prolonged instability of the type that Russia aspires to have in Ukraine, then that's going to be one of the results right now, that the voices who are now much lower inside of the EU could be much stronger over the time. And this will be a self-destructive position for the EU when we speak about the relevance of the EU in a global scene, in this blurred picture of the future of the world, as has been discussed in the previous panels today as well. This will be a much bleaker picture that could emerge if the revisionist power, which Russia is right now, will be capable in the short term to make the gains that can solidify and improve its position to be a different kind of a strategic player over the time in the long term as well against the EU.
Okay. There's lots in there that I think we can explore a little bit further. Just for instance, the question of solidifying Ukraine, which I think is another sort of thread running through different conversations that we've been having at this conference, supporting Ukraine in its European orientation. Maybe, you know, each of you can also speak a little bit about how you see, you know, quite concretely after the elections, the kind of Ukraine that could emerge from that, which could be perhaps have more of a national consensus that has been lacking for many years about its orientation, and therefore have a greater capacity in its political system to implement the kind of reforms that are good for Ukraine per se, but also good for advancing its relationship with the European Union. Because I think this is one of the key themes that underlines a lot of what the EU does or attempts to do in its neighborhood, but also around the world, is sort of the reform partnerships. So maybe each of you can take that on.
I think to begin with, it's very bad when you start the process of transformation of the type that Ukraine wants to have right now. And I disagree with the way how there is no real consensus, because ultimately Ukraine has been usurped for some time by a very corrupt government. So it was very hard to discern from that time what is an actual national consensus that the people could have had, what the European integration could have been. So now it's the real beginning for Ukraine's approximation with Europe. And then to begin right away to Ukrainians that we are not really ready to embrace you, frankly, when we speak about even the simple wording that the membership perspective per se is there for all the European nations who aspire to have that. And we all remember what were the negotiations before the Vilnius summit and what was the hard work being done at the time to have explicit statement like that, and why it never ended up in the ultimate text of the final document of the summit. Though all of that has resonance, obviously, in the societies that have to make really painful efforts in terms of transition and in terms of confronting the challenge that they have from Russia. So that's one. But then the actual meaningful help to Ukraine in terms of rebuilding the state institutions, of becoming a state in a meaningful sense of that, is something where you can actually do a lot, because that's the niche for the EU. And not only EU as an institution, but then individual member states. But all of that, I always come back to the security perhaps, but then if Ukraine will be destined to do it, in the whole context of destabilization, of factual dismemberment, and then basically building democracy at a gunpoint. We have a very painful experience of that in Georgia. And believe me, it's very hard to do institutional development of the country at a literal gunpoint when you have to tackle the security challenges of the type that a big neighbor can cause to you. And Ukraine is in a war space to some degree because it's an ongoing conflict right now.
Thanks a lot for that, Marek. Maybe just to pick up on one thing that Eka mentioned, the European perspective. I mean, some people say, you know, first put the European perspective, then the reforms will follow. Other people say, well, how can you talk about a realistic European perspective in the absence of a sense of a real commitment? And we've discussed this issue for many, many years. It's perhaps not the most productive discussion that we've had in the European Union. With, you know, your Polish roots, but also your wider perspective on this. Can you find a way of squaring the circle, knowing that you know, the lineup of forces in the EU is what it is, but let's find a productive way of handling that.
I think my impression is that a part of all these discussions about Ukraine's future in the European Union, how close bring Ukraine to European Union. Should we offer the membership or maybe only the devotion or friendship? I don't know. But I think that a huge part of this whole discussion is much more the discussion about European Union itself, not about the real future of Ukraine, especially in this moment in which Ukraine now is. And the psychology, I think, matters in the politics very much. And we have to recognize that Ukrainians are now in a situation of the existential threat. They are in a war. So we cannot, slow reaction is one weakness of the European Union, sometimes strength. But the second one is the path dependency. And so I think we cannot proceed as if it doesn't happen. We have to do with a country which is in an existential threat, and we have to help them if we would like to remain responsible. And if our words should mean something real. And I think what we should deliver is clarity of our position. We have discussed it yesterday. What does it mean? We cannot, on one hand, give this signal. Okay, we are ready now. We will sign the association agreement. But on the other hand, we are not ready to sign with you the free trade agreement because of, you know. We cannot behave in that situation with someone who is in an existential threat situation. We have to be consistent in our position. We can, of course, discuss how far we are ready to go, but then in these limits, you have to be consistent. We cannot play the two-track, free-track policy with someone who is in a very, very bad situation. And, of course, we have to use our tools, for example, of the Eastern Partnership policy or neighborhood policy, but in a much more smart way, responding to the real problems they have now in Ukraine. They have a problem with the information warfare.
Problem with energy. They have a problem.
They have a problem with energy, and they have a problem with a neighbor which tried to destabilize this country in economics and in a social order, in a political order. Okay,
thanks very much. Now, I think we're getting slowly towards the end of our discussion. I'd like to zoom out a little bit further because the Ukraine crisis, the relationship with Russia, the future of the Eastern Partnerships, they're tremendously important issues, but in Brussels it's true. We have to deal with multiple issues at the same time. We have to stabilize still the economy after the Euro crisis. We have to make sure that the UK doesn't leave. We have to also be aware that there's a much bigger world out there in which there are strategic shifts taking place that affect European security and European interests for years to come. I think about trends in Asia, about China, Japan. I think about developments in Africa. And I think if we're honest, there is also one divide. There are multiple divides in Brussels, but one divide is between the regionalist and the globalist. I mean, the regionalists say, look, aren't you aware what's happening now in and around Ukraine? This is the fundamental issue. And the answer, I simplify, is the membership perspective. And once we get a real solidified Ukraine, and in return, okay. The globalists say, yeah, that's all true, but there's a much bigger world out there where we got problems in the Middle East, we got Iran, a relationship with China, which is turning into a hegemon of its own. And the more and more we grow the European Union, yes, the more cumbersome the issues become, and the less unity there is to deal with these future challenges. So how would you, each of you, sort of address this globalist regionalist divide in Brussels?
Shall I?
Yeah, please. Yeah, certainly.
One few remark about sort of the internal perspectives, perhaps, and then I'll go to the particular question as well. To be clear, I mean, when we speak about the Ukraine's fate or Georgian or Moldovan fate, for that matter, societies in those countries, they don't have an expectation, and political elites, I would hope so as well, that we are about to have a free ride. Somebody will just give it out something to you because of the geopolitics, and that's about it. I mean, it's an immense homework that we have to do. It's just the chances that we ask to be given so that we viably pursue those processes in such a way that we come closer to the end point of being part of Europe in general terms as well, not only institutionally, I would say. And I think that is not really understood in Western societies in many ways. When we speak about the security, for example, it's always a question that I hear, we don't want to go and fight there, but Ukrainians never asked for that. Ukrainians asked for the tools or the means, equipment that would help them to fight, they fight. And that's the only way how they to be assisted in the security real, and not for somebody else to fight, they fight. And they do, they fight courageously, by the way. But when it comes to the future and then the global world, in a simplistic way, to have a relevance in terms of positioning in a very complex world, and I agree, and it's not only Ukraine as a problem or the eastern neighborhood of Europe in that sense, you have to have your house in order to have a position of strength to tackle other problems elsewhere globally. I hardly imagine for the EU to be a strong actor to tackle other problems globally, when in the middle of Europe you might have a successful revisionist power like Russia, and then the disentanglement from the Europe of countries that were formerly part of Soviet Union, made a big effort of becoming part of a civilized free world, and then Russia swallowed them back. I don't think that will gain any respect in terms of positioning for the EU, and then will restrict potential for having a positive impact on all sorts of the problems that you rightfully enumerated in your question.
Thanks very much, Eka. Marek, for you the last chance to comment on the regional global nexus.
But I mainly agree with what Eka said, because I think, first of all, I agree with those who argue that maybe the paradigm of globalization comes to its end. And it means that Europe is in a new situation. And the first problem for Europe now is to do the homework at home, especially after what has happened after 2008-9 in Europe. That is the main problem. The lack of self-confidence, the lack of the vision, what we are willing to do, what we would like to project. That's the problem, the main problem I see now. And regarding the problem to act outside, I think Europe has to act where it is welcome. It means if you see such an European devotion like you saw in Kiev or in Tbilisi, you cannot just not give any response to that. And if you are challenged, you have to also be able to act properly. But maybe it is the time where you can be worried about all the world and you try to answer all answers in the world is behind us.
Thanks very much, Marek and Eka. Thanks very much for this very stimulating discussion. With that, I end this session, and we'll continue the discussion at the conference itself. Thank you very much.
You.
Thank you both.